Chapter 30. I'll do my best. After eating a large dinner, Leila and Kyle walked down the street, each with an ice cream cone in hand. It was already dark out, and she had urged him to go back to the house where he was staying so he could prepare for the following day's exam, but he was being stubborn.
This is part of my preparation,
he insisted.
Walking with you will help my digestion.
She couldn't argue with his reasoning.
Fine, then let's walk a little more. But, Kyle.
Yeah?
Why do you want to marry me?
She cautiously asked, licking the cold, sweet ice cream from her lips.
If it's because you pity me.
Leila,
he firmly said. She was taken aback by his uncharacteristically stern tone. He stepped around to face her.
do you think of me as some sort of crazy man who would marry someone out of pity?
Frightened by his harsh tone, she made no reply.
Sure,
he said.
It's a big world, and there are plenty of crazy guys out there, some of whom would probably do such a thing. But I'm not one of them, Leila.
He let out a long sigh to calm his indignation.
You want to know why I want to marry you? It's because I love you.
Kyle.
That's it. That's my reason. Because I love Leila Llewellyn.
Looking at her nervous face, he sighed again and chuckled a bit.
Anyway, why should I pity you? I've tried proposing to you hundreds of times and you've turned me down every time. If anything, you should be pitying me, Leila.
He gently tousled her hair, then started walking ahead of her, not wanting to let her see the silly expression he was sure was on his face. As if she understood this, she stayed a pace behind him as they walked. They continued walking silently for a while, eventually reaching the hotel.
Good night, Leila,
he said, smiling.
Oh wait, I almost forgot.
Looking down at his melting ice cream, he slowly raised his head to look into her eyes.
Let's get married, Leila.
Even though he knew she was going to reject him, proposing to her had become a daily ritual, and it felt strange omitting it. This time, however, rather than saying good night, Kyle, and heading inside, she just stood there, saying nothing. He narrowed his eyes at her in puzzlement. He fully expected her to say the friendly but blunt sentence, "I'm not going to get married." Instead, she said something he could barely believe.
All right.
Whoa, Leila.
He dropped his cone out of shock. The melted ice cream splashed against his shoe, but he didn't care.
Did you just say that you'll marry me?
He stammered. With her eyes lowered, she nodded her head.
You're agreeing to get married? Married? To me?
He asked again in a shaky voice. She looked at him with a bashful expression, and once again nodded her head. She seemed like she was about to say something else, but before she could, Kyle let out an ecstatic shriek as he wrapped his arms around her.
Woohoo!
Several startled passers-by stopped and stared, but Kyle didn't care. He lifted Leila up in the air and spun her round and round, paying no mind to her startled cries. It was a sweet spring night. That night, Kyle dreamed that he and Leila got married and lived an ordinary, happy life as a married couple. Once, smiling bashfully, Leila had said to him,
One day long from now, when I get my own house, I want to have a little flower bed. I'm going to plant roses in that bed. When they bloom, I'm going to be really happy.
In the dream, she was standing next to the flower bed, looking even more beautiful than the roses that were blooming in it. Their children were running joyfully around nearby. The children's laughter rang out in the sunshine.
Daddy!
Shouted one of the children, running towards Kyle. The little girl had blonde hair, just like Leila. Next to her was a younger boy, still a toddler, who jumped to his feet and greeted Kyle. Kyle hugged the girl and lifted her into his arms. Walking towards Leila, he felt a gentle breeze blowing, It carried the sweet scent of roses. Leila smiled at him. Her smile was even more beautiful than the whole beautiful dream had been up to that point. Perhaps because of the joy the dream had brought him, he did even better on the exam than he had expected to. Is my dream about to come true? Could there be such a wonderful blessing in this world? He was so happy as he stepped out of the exam hall. He felt like he could fly when he saw Leila, who was waiting for him on a bench nearby. He really felt like he was starting to float in the air.
Leila!
He shouted. Turning to look at him, she closed the small book she had been reading and put it into the bag she had slung over her shoulder, then cheerfully started walking towards him.
How was the exam? Was it hard? Do you think you did well?
You're always worrying,
he said, raising his chin with swagger.
Leila, I'm Kyle Ettman. When it comes to studies, I never place second.
Ah, yes. Of course, that's right,
she replied, nodding exaggeratedly before bursting into laughter.
I forgot how smart you were, Mr. Ettman.
Wow, that's a shame. Make sure to remember it from now on,
he replied, playing along with her joke. He then furtively reached over to grab her hand. She flinched, but didn't pull her hand away. The late afternoon spring sunlight shone on Kyle's face as he smiled at her.
Do you really think you did well?
She asked, unable to stop herself from feeling slightly anxious. He chuckled at her question and replied,
Don't worry, I won't fail the exam, so there won't be anything bad that may prevent us from attending college together.
That's not what I was talking about.
She started to blush. As he looked at her reddening cheeks, they began to remind him of well-ripened peaches, and soon his neck felt hot. He regretted the fact that they were still on the busy campus around the exam hall. If they had been on an empty street, he might have felt brave enough to kiss her. No, if I did that, she might get scared and pull back. I need to wait a bit longer. That is right, just think of the shovel. He thought of Bill's big, dirty shovel and the ominous smile on Bill's face. The two strolled around the campus, holding hands, all the way from the medical school building where he would be studying, to the biology building where she would. As they walked, they took note of the distance between the buildings and laughed as they chatted.
You'll obviously pass, but I'm not so sure about myself,
she muttered as they arrived in front of the biology building.
Why are you worrying about that? Didn't you say you thought you did well on the exam?
Sure, but they only admit a very small number of female students each year.
Her expression grew sullen.
Ah, that's right.
It had only been a few years since the Berg Empire's universities had begun allowing female students to enroll, and they still only admitted a small proportion of female applicants, so it was much harder for female students to get a college education than male students.
Well, even so, you're going to get in,
he confidently asserted.
Who else could they possibly choose above you?
You don't think you're being a bit overconfident?
Not at all. It's a highly reliable conclusion I reached on the basis of the 8 years I've known you.
8 years. Time sure does fly.
She still vividly remembered riding in the mail coach towards Arvis. Somehow, 8 years had passed since then. Suddenly, she was struck by the sight of the fully grown young man that Kyle had become.
What's the matter?
He asked, wondering why she was staring at him so intently.
You've grown so much,
she solemnly exclaimed. Whenever she made this sort of random comment, it only made him love her more. It gave him a warm, fuzzy feeling inside. Even so, he wasn't sure how to respond.
Sure,
he finally said, grinning.
I've grown tall enough to be your husband.
She gasped playfully at this sly comment.
Do you like how I look?
He asked.
Well, hard to say.
Flustered, she started walking ahead with stiff steps. Seeing her acting shy like that made him smile even more warmly. On their way back, he told her about his beautiful dream, which would soon become reality. Their house, the life they would share together there, their beautiful children, and the new chapter in the history of the Ettman family that they and their children would write. He noticed with gladness that she was listening with what looked to be tentative anticipation. He wanted to turn that anticipation into reality. He even went as far as to wonder whether doing so was the reason he had been put on this earth.
How many kids should we have?
He asked.
Personally, I'd like it if we have a daughter and a son.
I think 5 would be about right.
He was shocked by the number she named, which seemed to be quite at odds with the hesitant way she usually discussed their future life together. Smiling brightly, she went on.
If we have a lot of kids like that, none of them will be lonely, and they'll be able to rely on each other for help when they need it. Haha. I love the thought of our home filled with a bunch of faces that resemble each other.
Despite the joyful look on her face, he felt a pang in his chest. Her bright smile only made him realize how lonely a life she had led.
5 kids? All right, Leila. I'll do my best.
Huh?
Her eyes widened at his bold reply. Staring at each other, they both started to blush at almost the same instant.
I wasn't talking about that,
he said, taking a step back. He was blushing more brightly than she was.
That's not all I think about, you know.
Me neither,
she replied. Both of them felt too embarrassed to make eye contact. They stopped holding hands and started walking with a bit of distance between them. Soon, stealing a sidelong glance at her, he burst into laughter, saying,
But Leila, if you're too shy for this sort of talk, how do you expect us to make 5 babies?
With a gasp, she turned and glared at him.
Miss Llewellyn, I know you excel at all subjects other than geometry. You didn't expect a stork to come with 5 babies in its beak, did you?
Now that he was teasing her even more, she started walking faster, still frowning. His delighted laughter grew louder along with the accelerating sound of her heels clicking on the ground.
Wait up, Mrs. Etman,
he playfully shouted. His voice reverberated throughout the campus. She started to run. Her braided ponytail bounced and swung behind her. He relished the sight as he watched her from behind. He felt like he was back in that wonderful dream. He didn't want to wake up. Ever.
AudiosKoppo